All right, hi everyone. We'll go and get started. This is Lola. I'm the coordinator of the Harvard and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center site for New England MHGTC. If you'd like, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. And now I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. Next slide, please. Participant microphones will be muted at entry. You can unmute them during the discussion portion if you'd like. If you have questions during the event, please use the chat box. This session is being recorded and it will be emailed out to all participants once it becomes available. If you have questions after the session, please email newengland@mhgtcnetwork.org. At the end of the month, we send out certificates of completion that you can submit to your particular board for continuing education credit. If you have any questions about those credits, you can contact ifisher@c4innovates.com for more information. Next slide, please. These are just some MHGTC acknowledgements. Next slide. The MHGTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. That language is strengths-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing-centered and trauma-responsive, inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys, person-first and free of labels, non-judgmental and avoiding assumptions, respectful, clear, and understandable, and lastly, consistent with our actions, policies, and products. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Keshavan for some introductions.
Yeah. Thank you, Lola. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and guide and philosopher, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Dr. Subramanian was born in southern India. He's a PhD from MIT and has over 45 years of experience as an engineer in the global manufacturing sector, where he is well known for his work as the president of the STIMS Institute, which is an advisory, consulting, and mentoring services. His has a tremendous experience in the area of Vedic philosophy of a universal appeal. And in addition to being an engineer, he has pursued this avidly throughout the last 40 years, and has recently published a book on spirituality in practice. Dr. Subramanian is also a distinguished fellow of two professional societies, ASME and SME, and has received the coveted Eugene Merchant Medal for Manufacturing. And he's also an author of two books in his field of engineering and global economy. And he's also the president of the American Association for Social Advancement of India. So Dr. Subramanian has, over the last several decades, really developed an approach to using spirituality in day-to-day practice. And I would recommend his book to everyone who is interested in this. Today, he's going to be talking about the application of principles of spirituality in our day-to-day life. And also, I have some reflections and a few slides after the end of his talk as well. And hopefully, we will have a few minutes of discussion at the end of that. So without further ado, Subbu, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keshavan, and thanks also to Lola and Raquel in organizing this. This is truly a privilege and a pleasure. I am not a medical person, and yet to be invited into a community of medical professionals is truly amazing, something that I could not have dreamed of a long time ago. But they're all connected one way or the other, no matter what profession we are involved in. It is that spirit of understanding who we are and why we function the way we do that prompted me to write the first two books, one in the year 2000 and the second in the year 2013. The second book has 7 transformational skills required for success in the 21st century economy. The seventh transformational skill we talk about is emotional intelligence, which is closely aligned with spirituality. So my studies on understanding what is spirituality, while it has been for decades, became more rigorous in the last decade or so, which I've been writing a series of blog posts, which culminated to about 200 essays. And I was suggested by a number of people, why don't you pull it together into a book? And that's how this book came to be and got published in March of this year. So the spirituality in practice is truly an exploration for peace and harmony within each of us, as well as collaboration and cohesiveness with all that surrounds us. In some respects, we can also define that as emotional intelligence. Lola will put the link for this book in the chat box. The book contains three major parts. One is what is spirituality? Second, a framework for spirituality and its application. Being an engineer and a scientist, a framework is easy to follow rather than a large collection of words and essays. We will cover both of these things in our presentation today. And the book itself contains over 80 essays, and I've selected about 20 of them and placed them in a slide specifically for you at the end of this presentation, so you can quickly go to them and get a quick refresher on some of the practical applications of spirituality in practice. So when we talk about spirituality, we talk about human beings. In fact, spirituality can be thought of in a larger context as the universe as a whole, which we'll come to it at the later part of this presentation. But why are we different from the stone or the plants or the animals? Anything else that is on the universe is because of our well-developed brain and the mind. Because of that, we are able to perceive objects, feel emotions, and think or reflect on thoughts. As a result, life is composed of three components, or three legs of a stool, if you were to give an analogy. The first is the health or physical well-being. Second is the emotional or social well-being, how we are connected to each other and so forth. And third is spiritual well-being, a sense of peace, a harmony within ourselves through our thoughts, and where do they come from? Why are they that way? We spend a large amount of our life worrying only about the health aspect of it. That is, of food, shelter, education, profession, any aspect of health and physical well-being. But because we are part of a society or a community, human being, a social animal, we also worry about like, dislike, happiness, unhappiness, beauty, ugly, race, color, gender, all kinds of things that connect us with the rest of the people around us. So that is where this emotional well-being comes in. But behind all this physical and emotional well-being is the undercurrent of our own thinking. Just like breathing, being spiritual is part of who we are. We are spiritual from the moment we are born to the moment our life journey ends. In fact, we use the word journey and the driver and the driven quite a bit in our conversation for the rest of the few minutes. There are two words I would like to bring to your attention, which are important to understand spirituality in practice. One is philosophy, which broadly can be translated for love for knowledge. In fact, in-depth study to understand the subject matter in any field is philosophy. That's why we get Doctor of Philosophy in any field. But for a period of time, philosophy of life and what it is and in-depth understanding has come to be known as quote-unquote philosophy. Second word is spirituality. It is very confusing because if you go and do a Google search for spirituality, you will get phrases and sentences rather than a simple definition. The reason for that is there is a lot of ambiguity between spirituality and religion and rituals and practices like yoga and meditation. All these are tools and means for self-reflection. But self-reflection ultimately leads us to connect with the driver behind who we are, or the spirit or the driving force. Similar to reality, where we say something is real means something I can relate to, something is tangible, something is obvious, something one I can explain to others. Similarly, spirituality relates to that which is the driving force behind everything we do. So in that sense, we look for body, mind, and intellect as a human complex driven by the mind as something like a car. And what drives, we drive the car. We know the distinction between I, the driver, and my car, the driven. What is the distinction between I, the person, and the body, mind, and intellect complex driven by my spirit or by my mind? And what is the driven? What's the connection between the driver and the driven is what we'll be discussing in the first half, and then look for some applications in the second half of this presentation. So we are not talking about anything clinical or medical about it, even though we are talking about the brain and the mind. But we are talking about the brain and the mind that's well functioning, driving the life, just like I'm driving a car, or you're driving a car, or riding a bicycle, or any other instrument, or any other vehicle. So if you were to think of our life like a car that's being driven, how do I recognize the potholes in life? How do I drive through them, or do I drive around them? How do I manage my daily life? Just like we manage the traffic jam and daily commute. How do I recognize the detours in life? Inevitably, there are detours when we drive a car. There are also detours in life. How do I manage that? We also talk about car with autopilot. In other words, you can sit in the car drives itself. Can the life of our own life, can it run on its own on autopilot? In fact, spirituality or literature and spirituality will tell you, if you eliminate the concept of I or ego, that is, I am different from nature, if you eliminate that single thought out of your thought process, you can run the life as if it is running on autopilot. Just like the plants grow, animals develop, we can also use our well-developed mind for our perception, feeling, and thoughts, and yet remain disconnected with them and run the life in autopilot. How to be at home with anywhere? If I can be equally disposed to anything and everything around me, just like a plant or an animal, then I can also be at home with anyone, with anything, without any distinction. The distinction of color, creed, race, gender, all the things which cloud our thinking disappears, and we develop a universal outlook. In that situation, then, I'm neither disturbed nor disturbing others. These are all the things that we'll try to understand. If we given the short time, I'll do my best, but hopefully you'll get to read and understand more about it through the resources available to you. By the way, the entire presentation and the entire work I've been doing for the last decade or more is all based on a large collection of literature available through Vedic philosophy called Upanishads, knowledge of the self and other scriptures, Bhagavad Gita, and many other resources collectively known as Eastern philosophy. So anything good you learn from this is thanks to those seers and masters over the thousands of years. Any mistakes I make are truly mine. So if you think about our body, mind, and intellect, then the question that comes is, if you connect it to the body and mind, or connected to the mind or the brain, and that is the complex that what we call our human equipment or human car or human bicycle, and we are connected to it to the driver, then we are told that this connection is made through three connectors, like the three ropes. In fact, the Sanskrit word for connection is guna, which means rope. The three ropes are, or three connectors or three wires are knowledge, bias, and ignorance. Next, we are told that these three things coexist all the time. To make it a little bit clear, here is an iPhone in my hand. We all know it's a phone. It's a mobile phone. I can not only use it for phone, but I can also use it for a camera. I can communicate with people. I can look at links on the internet, so on and so forth. So I have a pretty good knowledge of what this iPhone is. Maybe I know it is an Apple iPhone or Android phone. I don't know. I can look it up. But there's a GPS working in this, which I use all the time. But I have no clue how the GPS works, and yet I use the iPhone. So in other words, there is knowledge and there is some ignorance. At the same time, I know I can use this as a tool to communicate with everyone instantly. Because of this ability to communicate instantly, I'm eager to be communicated and be in touch with everyone every minute, every second of the day. So I keep looking at it all the time with attachment, with a preference, with a bias, which compels me to use the iPhone as if my whole life is dependent only on the iPhone. You know, the social problems involved with that. But the point here is the knowledge, bias, and ignorance, all of them coexist in my connection to this iPhone. Second point that we are told is that while all the three of the connectors coexist, only one of them is dominant over the other two. For example, when tranquility is dominant, when the knowledge is dominant, it's considered tranquility. And we observe that in our behavior. When bias is dominant, you're constantly jumping from one need to another need to want and not being satisfied and constantly doing more and more and more things. In fact, in an organization, when you see firefighting going all the time, you can be absolutely certain that bias or turbulence is dominant. Inertia, on the other hand, happens when the ignorance is dominant, even though there is some knowledge, some bias, and some ignorance. So we relate to the world around us through three ever-present connectors. All our experiences of any kind can be put into these three connectors, and the preponderant prevailing of knowledge or ignorance or bias, or the one of the three connectors dominate, leads to our experience, which can be described as tranquility, turbulence, or inertia. So this model itself is alone to kind of analyze whatever situation you're in. Am I tranquil? Am I turbulent? Or am I inertial? And if I am, why is it? Is it because the knowledge is dominant, or is it because my bias is dominant, or my ignorance is dominant? This one slide alone I can use for presentation for hours, and could have material for a course on relating to our experiences. But let's move on to look at a little bit more about the knowledge, bias, and ignorance. There's a table in the book 4.1 which describes some of these details, but I have even summarized it even further to make it brief for this presentation. So when the knowledge is dominant, our decision making reaches a higher level of performance. However, bias is dominant, we are constantly involved in a series of activities, each unable to satisfy our own needs and wants. When ignorance is dominant, it's a stalemate, there's a procrastination, there's a delusion. So next time your boss asks you to write a report, and if you're putting it away, ask yourself a question, is it because you know what you want to do and you're going to take care of some schedule? That is knowledge, then tranquil. Or you did something, but you're not sure, you don't have enough data, so you're not sure whether you're the best report. And because you're worried so much about whether the report will be good or bad, so you're constantly procrastinating, but at the same time, trying one draft after another, then that will be bias. You have no idea what to do, but you're afraid of asking anybody. So even though the boss has given 3 drop date deadlines, still we are letting it go. Then we clearly know ignorance is dominant. I can, of course, again, this one table with more detail behind it to analyze every aspect of the experience. In general, when the knowledge is dominant, the process is one of self-control, reasoning, and logic. When bias is dominant, we're ambivalent. Our reasoning is constantly overruled by our desires, needs, and wants. And when our ignorance is dominant, there's no reasoning, no logic. We look at black and call it white. We call white, call it black. Okay, so we know that we are connected to anything around us through the 3 connectors, and there's an equilibrium created by the dominance of one over the other 2. But then we have to deal with which one is, how accurate am I about observation of my connectors? This is where the concept of subjective versus objective comes in. Subjective is an action or behavior driven by our connectors instinctively and implicitly without any self-reflection. Objective, on the other hand, is a detachment, a level of stepping back and thinking about how, as a driver point of view, looking at the driven, engagement with the distance, reflection to study and use the connectors, not swaying side to side. Analogy could be like in a bicycle. You are the driver and the bicycle is the driven. We don't sway side to side, but we stay focused and try to be in the middle as best as we can. We also are living in the moment. That is not ruminating on the past or fixated in the future. That's the way nature is. For example, a wind that blows by does not really think of the second before what it did or what it did second after. It simply follows the pressure differential or the fluid dynamics that pertain to that flow of wind. Same is true for water. Same is true for fire. Any aspect of nature follows instinctively at a given moment. And by doing the same thing in our own actions is what you call as performing your duty. That is doing the right because it's the right thing to do. There is another aspect of it, which is constantly being mindful of the driven versus the driver. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. In other words, I distinctly know that the driver I is different from my bicycle. Nobody in their wild mind thinks I and the bicycle are one and the same. Same is true for our own life. What is the driver behind us? We'll come to that in a moment. But for the point number one was everything in the world that we can relate to through the three connectors, knowledge, ignorance, and bias. Dominance of the one over the other two lead to the equilibrium states of tranquility, turbulence, and inertia. And anything and everything we call experience is nothing more can be decomposed into the connectors and the dominant connector. The second point is life. Everything we do is a constant trade-off between subjectivity, that is impulsive action without self-reflection, or reflection on the connectors and engaging them in a more prudent, appropriate manner by not swaying or favoring one of the connectors and doing what is right to be done at the moment. Our experiences are caused by the connectors. Our experience is a reflection of the connectors. This brings us to the next slide. It's an important one, where it describes whatever I described to you so far in a little bit more pictorial way. Supposing somebody has got something to worry about, whatever it is. So you can ask the question, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? How am I supposed to do this? What is right and wrong? That itself is not it's a self-reflection, but that does not reflect self-control. But in order to exercise self-control, we have to externalize that, whatever that I'm thinking about, to say, what are the connectors involved? So this bald guy with the light bulb going is really showing is a self-control, is reflecting on the connectors, pulling that activity away from the world of activity. At the same time, the bald guy transforms into a judge because he's looking at all the connectors, all the evidences with equal weightage. Just to say, I want to be intelligent or I want to be unbiased by itself is a reflection of bias. We can go again more details to that, but nonetheless, equal regard for all the three connectors is the total self-control. Under that, when we progress from self-control to total self-control, we're able to see the dominance of one connector over the other, like a music conductor who calls on the various instruments to play the different notes in order to create the music. So the life becomes a music and we become the orchestra conductor using inertia, turbulence, and tranquility as the tools for managing the music. So this process of enlightened living is a progression from self-control, looking at the connectors, to total self-control, that is unbiased look at all the evidences through the three connectors and engaging in unattached active engagement. We are going to be engaged. To suggest that in order to live, we have to be monastic and live in under a mountain or a tree or something like that may apply for some people, but it's not the way it works for all of us. So while engaged in life, we can be disconnected and look at it from a different way. So this matter of disconnected, unattached active engagement may be a little bit confusing for some of you. I'll come to that in a little bit more in the next few slides. But right now, objectivity, that is stepping back and looking at the connectors with equal regard for all connectors and managing them and their ups and downs, observed to the tranquility, turbulence, inertia, is the true hallmark of any professional. In fact, all of us are professionals, do that all the time. For example, all of those of you in the medical field, as soon as a patient enters your medical facility, the patient and you are different. The patient could be your relative, your friend, somebody known to you, or an important person. It doesn't matter. It is somebody to be treated with, and the data pertaining to that medical condition is what drives your decisions, not any subjective opinions of whether they're good people, nice people, or whatever the other situation is. So if we are professional to the extent that we are able to step back and look at the activity by looking at it through the connectors of knowledge, bias, and ignorance, and through constant self-control. So to be spiritual, to be objective, to be under total self-control are not unique and strange esoteric concepts. They are who we are. In fact, more professional we are, more spiritual we are. It's only acknowledging that and putting it into practice. In other words, we're all players in the soccer field. It's a question of playing the game, and rather than being wondering, am I in the soccer field or am I baseball field? Now, I talked about driver and the driven and the unattached active engagement. This requires some degree of discussion. To do that, let's take another example. We all can relate to a boat. We all can relate to the people who are on the boat with all the safety equipment, paddle, and everything else. They are all on the ground. We know they're rigid, solid ground. Then they move the boat into the water, into a lake or a river, and everybody's floating on it. They are all objective to the extent that they stay to balance and weight and not pushing each other and paddling the boat so the boat is flowing along the river. But who is holding the boat up in the river? On the earth, gravity. On the water floating also, there is gravity. But if it's only gravity, then is nothing else, what will happen with the boat? It will get pulled further down into the bottom of the water level or the bottom of the lake or the ocean. But that doesn't happen. We are floating. Think for a second. What makes things float? If you ask, obviously, a middle school student of physics will say it is buoyancy. But what is buoyancy? Buoyancy is that which holds things up in a floating mode. Buoyancy happens whenever a fluid into which something else is suspended and held by the fluid. Now, I can explain to you through principles. We can use the principles of buoyancy to design huge ocean liners or torpedoes or whatever different thing that float, including the fish and the whale that floats in the water, use buoyancy. All our swimming, we use buoyancy. All the floating, use buoyancy. But what does the buoyancy come from? It is a phenomenon of nature. I cannot really explain to you other than to its evidence of whatever is floating, to the measurements through which I can explain to you how to put to buoyancy to benefit or quantify its effects. But buoyancy by itself cannot be described. That which cannot be described, but part of nature that exists all the time is what you call the driver or the enabler. So the driver or the enabler is an infinite collection of ever-present, objective, eternal laws of nature, incognitive and subtle. So that driver is the one through which we get to know the knowledge, bias, and inertia, and the ignorance, and the equilibrium state. And the driver in me, or in you, in all of us, are the laws of nature. So I, on the one side, is the driver, or the enabler. On the other side, I am the driven, and these two coexist all the time. This invisible, eternal, omnipresent driver are infinite number of laws of nature. There is a single noun given, a term given in Vedic philosophy called Brahman. Theologians use the word called God, or it's also spirit, soul, consciousness. So irrespective of what name we give, there is a driver that enables us to think, reflect, and understand the connectors and the equilibrium states and the cognitive nature of whatever it is happening through perception, feeling, and thinking. So if we were to say on one side, I am the laws of nature, I am the driver, I am the enabler, and I could also say I am the driven or the enabled. On the driven or a cognitive side, I think, therefore I am. On the incognitive driver side, I am, therefore I think. The Vedic philosophy states, I am by saying Aham Brahma, I am Brahman, or I am consciousness, Prajnanam Brahma. Everything is Brahman, Sarvam Brahmamayam. So all these are considered as Vedic grand pronouncements, which describe the incognitive, subtle enabler, which enables everything that we know as cognitive through perception, feeling, and thoughts. So the final point for us, first I said there are connectors. Second, I said there are equilibrium states across the connectors. Third, I said there is a trade-off between objectivity and subjectivity. And the fourth, I'm saying the driver and the driven are like two sides of a coin, ever present together, one enabling the other. There's a common foundation underneath all perceived differences. The common foundation are the laws of nature. We understand that subtle ideas such as love, compassion, unity, harmony, tolerance, these are all unique human qualities, are also products of nature. They are truly like buoyancy. They elevate us and uplift others. This knowledge and understanding brings unique joy, referred to in Vedic philosophy as bliss or ananda. It's also perceived as divinity in our daily life and in our way of living. So to summarize our presentation, we are subjective under the influence of the coexisting connectors. We feel alone, like droplets of water, when we are subjective. We can choose to be objective, part of a body of water, by examining the connectors in whatever we do in life. Only the human has the capacity to be subjective or objective. All other things are only objective, implicitly following the laws of nature. Subjective or objective, we're all enabled by the evidences of the laws of nature, collectively known as Brahman, soul, or God. These enablers are universal, omnipresent, objective, and eternal. As part of nature, we are not alone. So nobody ever feel that they're alone. Nobody ever feels to feel that they're foolish, because ignorance is an inherent part of one of the three connectors we're always dealing. We are universal and undivided, like a deep ocean, the sunshine, the sky, the space, or the cosmos. Now, to put it a little bit more in an example or practical term, what do you mean by live with the laws of nature unattached? One of the common examples that is given is that of a lotus flower and the lotus leaf that grows in the water. The lotus leaf and the lotus plant grows in the water, survives in the water, and yet remains unconnected with it. We also do the same thing. We drive a car, we use the car whenever we want, and then we walk out of it. We could have a frame of mind where we can do anything, where we can engage in that, fully aware of the connectors and the roles, but at the same time stay disconnected with it. That capacity within us is what is called spirituality. That capacity to be distance ourselves physically is what is trained through physical yoga, the posture of somebody in the ocean front doing a yogic pose, or someone who is able to disconnect their emotions and thoughts, which is a person sitting on a beach, a professional, which is in a meditative state, or people who are able to practice that in their actions, in their emotions, and in their thought all the time. More than the rest of us, they become identified as spiritual persons, such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Thoreau, and many others. Going to the picture on the right-hand side, so we are in the world of body, mind, and intellect through objects, emotion, thoughts. Through that, we connected to them through our experiences. The Sanskrit word for that is vasana or guna. And these connectors enable us to be connected. We are connected to them through the laws of nature, which is consciousness, self. So if we're staying at the level of the consciousness and the driver, we can look at the whole universe as undivided, or looking at the world of objects, perceptions, and feelings, the emotions and thoughts, we can feel ourselves to be divided. The choice is entirely within our own. So to summarize further, self-control and active engagement for larger common good is fostering a healthy mind through spirituality and practice. Self-control has two steps. One is reflection on the connectors. Second is persistent awareness that we, indeed everything, is enabled by the laws of nature, collectively known in the Vedic Eastern philosophy as Brahman. Persistent awareness of the enabler promotes faith and discipline in our action. And this faith and discipline in our action is what we get through tools and techniques such as meditation, yoga, religion, and so forth. Exploring the enabler or the driver enhances the divinity in us because we act as the nature would act, with objectivity, with detachment, with a goodwill for all and ill will for none. that is divinity. Exploring the enabler is also the fundamental to any scientific study. It is the laws of nature that you try to study and explore and find depth of it. And spirituality and science are two disciplines that require similar training, in my opinion. To further summarize, may our life in any form of existence be dedicated to total self-control and unattached active engagement. There are a few verses from Bhagavad Gita that I like to give as practical examples. Through self-control, we remain as our own best friend, and we also become good friend for everyone else. Lacking in self-control, we become our own enemy. An enlightened person with true self-control and true awareness of the drivers does not disturb others nor disturbed by others. We drive the car all the time on the highway. We are not disturbed by other drivers or other cars to the extent we are minding our car and our driving in a very objective, proper way. Unrelenting desire, anger, and vanity are the forces that arise due to the turbulent nature. That is the dominance of bias or the turbulence in our life. These are the enemies of an individual. It is said that controlling the sense organs is good, control over the mind or emotions is better, controlling the intellect may be the best. The enlightened person controls all three and yet actively engages them. Such enlightened person is considered the most superior of all. If you study closely all the teachings in Buddhist philosophy and training, you will find these verses repeated in many different forms and different ways. So to conclude, medicine alone is not enough to treat illness, while through medicine, you do God's work for the rest of us. Healthy mind and thoughts lead to healthful emotions, which in turn heal our body. So we need a balance between health or physical well-being, emotional or social well-being, or spiritual or intellectual well-being. Spirituality in practice is a means, a way of life for anyone at any age that promotes peace and harmony within and cohesiveness and collaboration with all that surround us. This education can be self-driven as well as taught, in my opinion, at any age for anyone. The spirituality in practice may indeed be needed for all of us who are caregivers and healthcare professionals, because the stronger your mind, stronger your emotional management through the self-control and attached engagement, the more you're able to help others, your patients, for their healthful mind. Spirituality in practice may be the antidote for all the things that we can, the social ill, like social media-induced isolation, self-selection, and mental health concerns. I think I come to the end of my presentation. I promised you one slide where I said I will give you a selection. There are 80 essays in this book. I've given you about 20 essays selected for a quick reading and benefiting from. So this is my contact information, my name, my website, blog site, and I stop here. Thank you very, very much for your attention. I'm sorry I might have been very fast. I apologize, but we are always available all the time to be connected. Thanks again, Dr. Keshav.
Thank you, Dr. Subbu. If you stop sharing, I can share my slides. Wonderful. Okay. So my goal is to expand upon and to some extent unpack Dr. Subbu's very thoughtful summary of really a large body of knowledge that exists in the Eastern scriptures about spirituality and its application in practice for peaceful living. So let me see if I can share. Can people see my slides? Putting it on slideshow right now. Okay. Subbu, can you see this?
Yes, yes.
So Dr. Subbu several times referred to this scripture, and he did not have time to kind of expand on what it is. So this is like the Bible of the Hindu spirituality. And what it is like just like many other things, like including the Upanishads that the Hindus have done. and the Buddhists over the last several thousand years, they convey the concepts through stories. So here is the story of what you might be called the First World War, which was the Mahabharata, in which there is a warrior, which is Arjuna, who becomes kind of panic-stricken in the middle of the beginning of the war, where he has to fight his evil cousins for the common good of mankind. But in doing so, he may have to, kill some of his own cousins. And so he kind of develops cold feet and charioteer, which is the gives Arjuna a 18-session psychotherapy, so to speak, in the middle of the battlefield, which became the Bhagavad Gita, basically. So what Dr. Subbu was telling you for the last half an hour was many of the pearls of wisdom from the Bhagavad Gita, which is based on the earlier scriptures like the Upanishads. And being a mental health professional, my job is to kind of unpack those insights for the mental health professionals and tell you what is the relevance of these principles for mental health and how do they relate to some of the modern psychotherapeutic approaches. So I will do so by pointing out to you what I might call the 10 pearls of wisdom, if you will, towards positive mental health that may be gleaned from Eastern spiritual principles. So the first of those is, even before I get into that, the one thing that the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads did was to use a metaphor. Dr. Subbu gave you the metaphor of the car. The car did not exist in 4,000 years ago. So they had a different metaphor. They said we are like a chariot, and our senses are like the horses that draw this chariot. Our mind are the reins that control these senses, and our intellect is the driver, and our soul is the passengers that travels from one chariot to another throughout life. So this was an analogy that really explains the integral nature of the mind, body, and the spirit, which was reflected, thousands of years ago by the Upanishads, but also became part of what Plato in Western philosophy did as well. So it's become one grounding principle of integrating the mind and body. However, so of course, we can also relate this to how the brain and the mind are constructed as well. We'll come to that point a bit later. Dr. Subbu also mentioned to you that the mind and the body and the spirituality are three legs of the same stool. Integrating them is a way to build positive mental health, and that is where yoga comes in. The word yoga actually means integration. It means yoke. That is, it is what balances the different aspects of us, the mind and the body and the spirit. We'll talk about that in a moment. In the Bhagavad Gita, as originally defined, yoga is not just doing some postures. It is a lifestyle. It involves many things, including the mind, body, and the spirit. So the first principle that comes from Eastern spiritual literature is that, the ultimate knowledge is self-knowledge. Unlike Western philosophy, going back to René Descartes, where the thinking was that you think and so therefore you are. In other words, your mind is the central reality. The Eastern philosophy makes the argument that the mind that we think as our minds are those that come and go. The thoughts come and go, the emotions come and go, but there is the observer, the seer, and the seen. So it's always important to keep in mind that there is a constant presence of us, which is the higher self. And then there is the thought processes and the emotions that are part of our fluctuating mind. So the key principle is to realize that you're not your thoughts. You are the owner or the observer of your thoughts. So that is the fundamental principle of Eastern thinking. And this has been translated into modern psychotherapy, an approach called metacognitive therapy. So as opposed to thinking, I am a loser, for example, if you distance yourself and observe yourself and say, there I go again, having the thought that I'm a loser, it immediately reduces the pain of experiencing being a loser. And this is the kind of approach that Adrian Wells has developed as metacognitive therapy. The second important principle that comes from Eastern thinking is to accept that everything changes. There's nothing permanent. Accepting impermanence is a key principle. And that is a fundamental principle within what we call acceptance and commitment therapy, which was developed by Hayes going back a few years ago. The third key principle from the Eastern philosophy is that one should think about what is the right action. And this approach is called the action yoga, or the principles of action you might call karma yoga. The right action is something that involves the right kind of engagement. So you engage at your level of competence, not too hard, not too easy, and something that you are good at. And that, one of the psychologists, well-known psychologists by name Csikszentmihalyi, has called it the state of flow. When you're engaging in art or music or your favorite activity or in nature, you lose yourself, you lose the sense of time. And that is the state of mind called flow, where there is that kind of constant sense of contentment and peace while being actively engaged. And engagement also needs to be sustainable. It's better to be motivated through intrinsic motivation as opposed to having be constantly contingent upon external rewards. It is called intrinsic motivation. And also the right mindset would involve being able to recognize that it is your effort that matters, not necessarily a fixed capacity. And finally, right action also involves a higher purpose. It's not just for you. It's for the higher good, and so on. So that is captured in this aphorism that focus on the journey and not the destination. Then, the Japanese have done it very well by their concept of ikigai. When people come and ask me, what should I do for my career and so on, I like to tell them, try to find what you're good at, what you actually love, and what the world needs, and finally, what pays you. And so it is at the intersection of this is the perfect career for you. That's the way I have thought about this for a long time. And this is very central to the principles of Eastern spirituality. I also think of these principles in the context of how our brains have evolved. And Dr. Subbu talked to you about the three levels of intellect and passion, and then ignorance, or intellect and bias and ignorance. But at a brain level, you think of it as a higher human level of brain development and primate level of brain development, and then more mammalian, and then more reptilian. So at the lowest levels, we are focused more on safety and immediate physiological needs, and like hunger and thirst and sex and so on. And then there is a when you elevate higher in the evolutionary ladder, you become more passionate about power and control and self-esteem and love and belonging. And then only at highest levels does one focus on truth and beauty and self-actualization and so on. This is by Abraham Maslow called that the need hierarchy, which is very similar to the gunas that are described in Eastern thinking. And of course, from a neurological terms, it is the reptilian, mammalian, and the neo-mammalian brains. Then what is happiness? Eastern thinking points to the fact that happiness is a choice. It can be under our control. We equate often happiness with pleasure of getting something that you want. But this getting something you want is relative and keeps changing. You get promoted and you get a new car, but then you look at your neighbor who has a Tesla Model 3, you want that and you get that, and then you want something higher and then higher and so on. So it is called the hedonic treadmill because you keep on hankering after more and more things, but the level of happiness you get is about the same. But the level of happiness that you get, what you call the happiness set point, is something that is you can train. It is under your control, and that control can better arise from yogic practices. The sixth key point is balance and regulation. That is, for happiness and peace and living contentedly, one needs to observe one's own emotions and bring them into balance with one's own conscious intellect. And that kind of an emotion regulation is the central principle behind another approach to psychotherapy, which was developed by Marshall Linehan, called dialectical behavior therapy, which is used in many psychiatric disorders, including borderline disorders. The seventh key principle is being mindful. And, the mind is like a monkey, as Eastern spiritual thinkers talk about. And that can be brought under regulation through different mindfulness practices. There are different types of those that include what is called a one-point concentration, in which you engage certain parts of the brain that are engaged in tasks, whether it is focusing on a particular task, whether it's music or art or you're playing chess and things like that. That is one kind of mindfulness. The other kind of mindfulness is to just let your mind wander and just observe your thoughts as they come and go. And that is what activates another kind of brain circuitry called the default mode network. Mindfulness, depending on what type of mindfulness you practice, can hone and train both these circuits, which is important for our optimal functioning. The eighth principle that I would like to say one learns from Eastern thinking is to kind of be in awe of something greater than yourself. And so that is why nature is so therapeutic. It immediately begins to tell you how small you are, and that's an important principle for positive mental health. And the ninth key principle, which is very central to the Bhagavad Gita, when Dr. Subbu said intellect is better than knowledge, and devotion is better than intellect, and so forth. Ultimately, what the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads talk about is, letting go is one of the most important principles, the strongest ways of developing positive mental health. Letting go does help, of course, unless you are in a survival situation. And this is also, letting go is also a key principle in another approach to psychotherapy, which we talked about, called acceptance and commitment therapy. Finally, here's a cartoon that, I can even apply that to myself. I've been on the path to enlightenment for 40 years. Isn't there a shortcut? The answer is no. It's a constant process of continuously learning and growing. So in summary, lessons from Eastern traditions involve accepting impermanence, letting go, becoming aware of your higher self, realizing that you're not just your thoughts, and engage in right action, focus on journey, doing what one loves, commit to a higher purpose, be present, be balanced, and remember that happiness is a choice. And all of these principles translate themselves very nicely to many of the modern psychotherapeutic approaches that we currently practice. Thank you. So I will stop my slides here, and we have about 5 minutes for any questions and discussions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions or thoughts.
You could also comment on what you heard and what your reflections are. Was it something relevant, useful, that might be elaborated on or left out?
I want to thank you both for an excellent presentation. This is Shirley Ann speaking. I can undo my video as well. That was very, very interesting. And I was wondering about one thought that occurred to me while listening to this was sort of our current focus on acceptance of all emotions, whatever they may be, including some of the more difficult emotions or the ones that we generally try to push away. And I was wondering about your, from both of you, your respective take on that in terms of these are also unwanted emotions, I think, and they can be overwhelming. And I can sort of see multiple perspectives towards how we conceptual or how we view these emotions and how we should approach these emotions from your presentations. If you could just comment a little bit about that, thanks.
Subbu, do you want to go first?
No, I'll let you go first.
Okay. So it's a great question, Shirley. So there are two approaches to addressing unwanted or negative thoughts. One approach, which Western psychotherapies developed, going back to R&T Beck, is to kind of wrestle with those negative thoughts and correct them by bringing in observations and using alternative, more neutral or positive viewpoints and so on. In other words, work with the content of your thinking itself. The other approach is to let the thoughts come and flow and acknowledge them, but observe them and remember that you are not the thoughts, and let the spontaneous ebbing and flowing of these take care of the negative thoughts. Eastern thinking takes the second approach.
Mm-hmm.
Western psychology takes more of the first approach. Both of those approaches, in my view, are rooted in Western philosophy versus Eastern philosophy of where the thought originates. Cognitive behavior therapy, which R&T Beck developed, has centrally the approach of focusing on the contents of the mind without worrying about whether there is a metacognition or not. Whereas Eastern thinking focuses more on the owner of the thoughts process, the agency of the thought process, and the observer versus the observed. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And I do see that there's some questions in the comments as well.
I'll just take a little brief take on it, more as a common man and not a medical expert in mind, but like Dr. Keshwan. I would answer it in the same way, but in a different words, perhaps. That is, if we begin to train ourselves to think any experience, good, bad, indifferent, is connected through a knowledge bias and ignorance. And if you become observers of that, then managing the experience, ups and downs, it's absolutely unquestionably reality that will be happy, will be sorrow, will be good, will be bad, will be excited, will be depressed. That's the way it is. That's the law of nature. A big plant under which a small plant grows. Whenever the small plant is growing, it doesn't get enough sunshade, it could feel depressed. So it grows towards where there's more sunshine. Instinctively, it follows the laws of nature. Except we tend to think not so much into the laws of nature, but instead we tend to think only in terms of evidences and the responses. For example, if I feel unhappy when somebody told something to me, I could simply say, what did they tell me? Why am I unhappy about? Am I unhappy about because they hurt me, because I did not know something before? In other words, they exposed my ignorance? Then I shouldn't be unhappy. I should be happy. I should give them $10. Or if they're happy, if I'm unhappy because they're telling me something which I already know, but I cannot implement in this particular situation, well, then I use my knowledge to kind of not be overwhelmed by bias that they told me. Because, for example, if a child kicks me, I have no problem. I'll smile at it. But someone else kicks at me, I get mad. But the nature of our response is largely context-based to the extent the happiness or unhappiness can also be looked at in the context-based. And then you can also think about it from a knowledge point of view. That is, yeah, I learned something out of this. I'll put it to use somewhere else. As soon as I think like that, my unhappiness or my disturbance goes away. So in a practical sense, these connectors are very useful tools to kind of manage. It's really called reins or the ropes.
So, Subbu, there is one question. Are there considerations for older adults to develop SIP if they have not done it earlier in life?
Actually, that's a very good question. The reality is, what is really happening is they already have a book and they're reading the book. I mean, they've not read the book, but they have it in their library. So sometimes they might even have read it, but they've forgotten about it. So spirituality, as I said, is not something one has to learn and acquire only as one grows older. It's only retuning our mind to start looking at things in the context of knowledge, bias, and ignorance, the dominance of one over the other on one side of the coin, and constant reflection. No matter what happens, we're all part of nature, governed by the laws of nature. So can this knowledge and this simplified framework can come only at the old age, or can it come at younger age? In my opinion, it should come at any age. The sooner the better, but that does not disqualify old people from not getting there.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we're a couple of minutes beyond our audience's time, but I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes if needed. And Subbu, feel free to as well.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question, may I?
Yes, please.
So I wanted your perspective, both from medical as well as engineering point of view. Like, we talk about Indian philosophy as the driver and we leave it to Almighty and take as things as it comes, observe it like a lotus leaf. All that is fine. But what about willpower? And like, don't we have any control at all then to think of how do we direct the life? How do we pursue things? Even spirituality should come through some aspect of will. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Maybe I'll take it first. If it's okay, Doctor.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant question. Actually, if you truly believe in the model that I laid out for you, that everything that we know of on this where we live or where we exist is connected to knowledge, bias, and ignorance. In fact, the Bhagavad Gita verse for that states, without quoting the Sanskrit itself, says the driver and the driven are incessantly, invariably connected through everything through the three connectors: knowledge, bias, and ignorance. If that were true, it should also apply to the will. That is, my intention or wanting to do something. My will of wanting to do something could also be driven by knowledge, by bias, and ignorance, and the dominance of one over the other two. So when I have the knowledge-driven will that is dominant, I will say I'm very tranquil. My strategy is very good. Like for a company, the will is the strategy. And the strategy is very good and they're successful and they're able to handle things that come their way in a challenging as required. If the will is turbulent, that is based only on emotions and passions and wants and needs. In other words, I am starting a company, I've got a strategy where I want to grow 30% every year, no matter what, and hire and fire people as I go along. And that's a turbulent strategy. As a result of which, the company will go ups and downs, stock prices will go up and down, and the people will suffer. Some people in some time will get benefit, sometimes will lose. All this constant firefighting will go on. If the will is one based on ignorance, that is, I want to jump across a lake, but I want to jump only half across the lake, and I don't know how to swim. There's no such thing as jumping half across the lake, but that will be a will based on ignorance. So what I'm trying to say is any one of these aspects of anything that we can think of, we can step back and look at it in the context of knowledge, bias, and ignorance. And the dominant one will determine our equilibrium state of tranquility, turbulence, or inertia. If you look at the table 4.1, it gives a brilliant outline, not because I wrote it, because it is taken from the scriptures, and how to look for how we can observe knowledge, bias, and ignorance, and their effect before something's happened, during something happened, after something's happened, how can use as a corrective tool, so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I agree with Dr. Subbu in principle. There is as you know, Shantala, there is a huge debate as to whether free will exists or not. I don't think we have the time or the bandwidth to get into that at this time. But, in my understanding, the Eastern spiritual thinking acknowledges the existence of a free will and connects it, as Subbu says, to the different levels of our mind. So, the Bhagavad Gita very clearly says, you are your own best enemy, or you are your own best friend. And so, if the agency of the self acts in accordance with the different layers of the mind, whether it is the lowest layer of survival or passion and love, or the higher levels of enlightenment and intellect, we may take different kinds of actions. So the free will is clearly under the influence of how we construct our own concept of our mind. If we separate ourselves from our individual self, but go into a higher metacognitive self, the actions that are taken by ourselves might be quite different. And so free will is a relative term. It can be exercised depending on from which self you're looking at. I think those were excellent questions, and thank you all for listening patiently. I think maybe I can leave a last question for Sheshadri Ramaswamy, who is in the audience. I just noticed, I'm sure he has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was tempted to talk about it, but I'm refraining myself. So I've been doing research in the area of neuroscience and trying to understand brain. And my definition of self is, I am body and mind in this world at this instant. So essentially, the primordial part of me is the body with all the sensory organs, and the newer mammalian or the human side of it is the cognitive brain, and that is the same as the mind. In other words, as an engineer, I think of everything happening in hardware. So I find it difficult to accept that there is something called free will that is not present in a hardware form. So I associate it to mind, and mind itself becomes the cognitive portion of the brain, which is residing in the cortex, but yet is capable of operating independently of the rest of the body, brain, and the limbic system. So the discussion I had with Shantala is free will is an aspect of mind. And when we say I did it out of free will, that I really feel that something in my short-term memory, either from an external stimulus or from internal thoughts that were ongoing, triggered something, and I'm responding to that. So it is really, free will is a stimulus, internally generated or external stimulus, and it is executed by the mental portion of the cortex. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, you touched upon what scientists and philosophers have frequently referred to as the hard question. And at the end, with less than 1 minute left, I don't think we can get into the hard question as to whether free will exists, and if so, what is it, and so on. But this is a very stimulating discussion. Thank you all very much. Hope to see you all in our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
It's a good lecture. Thank you.